Congratulations, best wishes, peace and power to the newly elected officers who were installed earlier today by the Honorable Alexis M. Herman. The colleagues of our staff are here to serve you and the mission of NCNW, which is to lead, advocate for, and empower women of African descent, their families, and communities. To all attendees, thanks for your patience, your guidance, your understanding, your comments, your willingness to tackle something new and a little bit different, and for being guinea pigs on this excursion to a new technological frontier. Thanks to each and every one of the nearly 100 speakers who we've heard from over the last 3 days. I would be remiss if I did not thank personally Dr. Thelma Daly for chairing the program rules, affiliates, functions of the convention, to Pat Lattimore for her stalwart leadership of the credentials and registration process, and to Donna Michelle Fields and Regina Majors for their support of the marketing effort, and to all of the sisters of NCNW who pitched in without complaining, with lots of energy and enthusiasm to make this convention possible. Congratulations and job well done to the new Committee on Young Adult Affairs. Ari Brazier, Shara Denton, and Ariane Jamerson. It gives me great joy and pleasure to see you embark on the new assignment, that you're already demonstrating that you're up for the task. And thanks to the REACH Committee, led by Diane Larche, Dr. Lois Keith, Willis Williams, and all the 40-some members of that committee who've been working across the country. We're going to move on to where do we go from here, which is the appropriate way to end a 4-day convention. But as Dr. Cole says, it never hurts to be grateful. With an humble heart, I must express love and appreciation to Crystal Ramser, my partner in all things, our Chief Administrative Officer, Kevin Johannes, who manages our and directs our communications, Mr. David Glenn in membership, our new addition, Rosalind Hannibal Booker in development, for joining our happy band, to Ms. Holder for doing everything from recruiting volunteers to hooking us up with the Clark sisters, to Sister Summer, also known as Summerlin Stovall, for her fastidious attention to Dr. Cole. The same is true for Ms. Kuhn for managing the sponsors and making sure the bills get paid, and for the blessing to me known as Driana Perkins. Thanks, Melinda and Cynthia Wheeler. Thanks, Ms. Green, for staying up all night to get the PowerPoints for today prepared. And Kayla Allen, our newest member, thanks to you as well. Now, what we want to do today is talk a little bit about, we've heard so much over these past 3 days. What do we take home with us? What is our action plan? What is our guidance? And I don't think there's anyone better to do that. After all, this phrase comes from Dr. Martin Luther King. And we would ask the technical staff if they would pull up the PowerPoint presentation at this time. And we'll spend just a few minutes setting the table. And some Q&A with the audience. So if we could have the PowerPoint for this session, please. How many times have you listened to Martin Luther King Day services and they say, well, what would Dr. King think? What would Dr. King say? Well, just like Mary McLeod Bethune, we don't have to wonder what Dr. King would think about where we should be going, because he made a point of saying it and writing it while he was still in the flesh with us. In 1967, he gave a speech, Dr. Cole, to the assembled delegates of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference Convention in Atlanta. And now, some half a century later, his words still speak to us across the decades. Are we able to pull up the PowerPoint presentation? There it is. Thank you very much. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? As I said, it was an address delivered by Dr. King in 1967. Let's have the next slide, please. I think you will be, unless you've studied this a lot more than I have, you'll be inspired and awakened by what Dr. King had to say to us in 1967. May we have the next slide, please? Our panelists today are Chairwoman Karen Bass, Miss Naomi Wadler. Marsha Fudge cannot be with us. She was with us earlier in the week. Mr. Spencer Overton from the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies is here. Reverend Sharpton had a commitment that he had to keep at a certain time, and we were running just a little bit late, but he sent us some words in video. May we have the next slide, please? Dr. King talked about dignity and self-worth. Power without love is reckless and abusive. Love without power is sentimental and anemic. Next slide, please. The Negro still lives in the basement of the Great Society. Now, he's talking about the 60s. Even after his release from chattel slavery, the nation grew over him, submerging him and leaving him far behind. When we think about disparities, we think about being left behind. May we have the next slide, please? Black Lives Matter. Well, of course, Dr. King didn't use the phrase Black Lives Matter, but he did say Negroes seemed almost invisible to the larger society, and the facts of their harsh lives were unknown to the majority of the nation. But today, civil rights is a dominating issue in every state, crowding the pages of the press and the daily conversation of white Americans. That could have been written this morning. May we have the next slide, please? He talks about voting rights in his speech to his delegates. All types of conniving methods being used to keep the Negro from becoming a registered voter. Conniving methods. I suspect that has something to do with voter suppression. Voter registration drives, political education, literacy, Planned Parenthood, and get out the vote efforts are the solid foundation of adult education and community organization upon which all social change must ultimately rest. It is if he is speaking to us from right now. Next slide, please. Urban quality of life. We've heard criticism. We had our mayors on earlier this week because we wanted the world to know that these women are not do-nothings. They are smart, capable, energetic leaders. But listen to this from Dr. King. The deep rumbling of discontent in our cities is indicative of the fact that the plant of freedom has grown only a bud and not yet a flower. Next slide, please. Economic opportunity. You know, we think about Dr. King being a man of love, a man of peace, a man of justice, but more than half of this speech was devoted to economic opportunity. Here are just a couple of snippets of what he had to say. Opportunity to own their own homes, develop financial institutions sensitive to problems of the Negro community, negotiate to utilize services of Negro-owned firms. We call it entrepreneurship now. And to poor communities and counties, urban and rural, to establish OEO projects. Well, we don't have the Office of Economic Opportunity anymore, but perhaps we should. Next slide, please. Economic security. Now, this was startling to me. We must create full employment or we must create incomes. Drive the nation to a guaranteed annual income society. Dislocation in the market operation of our economy and the prevalence of discrimination thrust people into idleness and bind them in constant or frequent unemployment. Dislocations, we're in a dislocation right now, aren't we? The pandemic is a kind of economic dislocation. Next slide, please. Racism and poverty. And one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? We must honestly face the fact that we must address the question of restructuring the whole of American society. A nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will thingify them and make them things, and therefore they will exploit them and poor people generally economically. Racism and poverty. When people talk about defunding the police Aren't they talking about a kind of restructuring of the economy? Let's go on to the next slide. No matter how dynamically the economy develops and expands, it does not eliminate all poverty. The stock market is off the charts right now, but it has not eliminated poverty. And that's the question that Dr. King is posing to us. Let's go to the final slide. A time for action, a strategy for change. This is no time for romantic illusions and philosophical debates about freedom. This is a time for action. What is needed is a strategy for change, a tactical program that will bring the Negro into the mainstream of American life as quickly as possible. So far, this has been only offered by the nonviolent movement. So with that setting the table, what I'd like to do now is ask our panelists, beginning with Chairman Bass, to bring us just a few words of opening remarks before we do that, we want to properly introduce her because she is so accomplished, and I want the audience to know exactly who she is. Karen Bass is chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus. She has worked on a number of issues. She represents a district in California. She has been a member of Congress. I believe this is your sixth term or fifth term. And we're just so grateful to have her here with us. Karen Bass, a few opening remarks, please.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me here. It's my honor to be here to speak with you. And from what I've heard, you've had a great 4-day conference. I do have to say that the legacy of the organization is just huge and has made such a big difference in our country. And I want to thank my dear friend and mentor, Dr. Johnnetta Cole. When Dr. Cole calls, we all respond. And so I'm happy to be with you here today. We are 30 plus days away from an election, and I'm so tired of calling it the most important election of our lifetime. I now say that this election is about life and death. And I say that because we have lost over 200,000 Americans. And we do not know the demographic breakdown, and I think that's quite deliberate, but we do know that a disproportionate number of those souls that have been lost are African Americans. And so we need to think about that because we have not had a national strategy. And if we do not change leadership in the next 30 plus days, we will continue to not have a national strategy. And a year from now, I can't even imagine how many Americans' lives will be lost. So we need to think about the election from that point of view. Also, COVID has had such an incredible impact on our community, not just health, but economics. We hadn't recovered from the last Great Recession, and now we are facing economic catastrophe from the pandemic, and we can't address the economics until we address the health. So we have so much at stake. The election is what is right before us, but we also have to remember that we now have 30 additional days for the census, and we have to make sure that our community is counted. We already know that there is a significant undercount in the Black community. And so we have now, because of a court ruling, until the end of October. We have to be thinking about the election coming up in the next few days, but we also have to think about the next 10 years because the census is what determines the resources in our community. What has basically happened in our country is conservatives, the right wing, have decided to take over the third branch of the government. There's the legislative branch, of which I serve in Congress. There's the administration, of which we will be voting on in the next few days, but there's the judiciary. We know we have a Supreme Court justice pending, but in Trump's time, he has approved, or the Senate has confirmed, over 200 judges, and they are overwhelmingly conservative, overwhelmingly white male. And so there is a part of our society that just cannot accept the fact that America is becoming browner and browner. And so their solution to that is to take over the judiciary. We have so much at stake over these next few months. And I am confident, though, that our community is fired up, and that we're going to do the right thing. I know we'll be talking a little bit more about that later, and I will be happy to make that my call of action. The next 30 plus days, we have to show up, show out, turn out to make sure we get the vote.
Thank you so much. Truer words were never spoken. Next, we want to hear from Naomi Wadler, a 13-year-old student activist who gained national attention for her speech at the March for Our Lives in Washington on March 24, 2018. Her speech focused on the disproportionate number of Black and Brown women who are victims of gun violence. Prior to the march, Naomi led a student walkout at her elementary school in Alexandria, Virginia, on the 1 month anniversary of the senseless shooting at Marjorie Stoneman High School in Parkland, Florida. Her school walkout was 18 minutes long, 17 minutes for each student and one teacher who lost their lives. Parkland, and 1 additional minute for Cortland Arrington, an African American student who was murdered shortly after the Parkland shooting in her Alabama high school. Naomi's mission is to change the narrative around African American girls and to acknowledge and represent the African American girls whose stories don't make the front page of every national newspaper, whose stories don't lead on the evening news. Naomi believes every person is valuable. She hopes more people will join her effort to remember Cortland, Breonna, and the many African American girls lost to all gun violence around the country, whose potential will never be fully realized. Please join me in welcoming Naomi Wadler.
Thank you so much for having me this morning. I particularly want to thank the amazing Thelma Daly, who has helped keep a guiding eye on me for years now. I am honored to speak today with icons and peoples whose lives and leadership will be learned for generations to come. I feel privileged to have this platform, and I know well that I stand on the shoulders of giants, including the people that I am speaking with today. Kobe, Little Richard, Fred Curley Neal, Andre Harrell, B. Smith, C.T. Vivian, John Lewis, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. 2020 has truly been a terrible year. Leaders and legends have left us with nothing but their legacies to carry on. The thing about representing the youth on this panel, I want you to know that we all feel the pressure of carrying on the work that many have performed before us, of making the change envisioned by our elders to come to a reality. It is a weird and heavy burden of responsibility that we have asked for, but which has also been placed upon us by the people who have not yet reached their goals. I gained recognition for my voice when I was 11, and I am almost 14 years old now. One of the things that I remember most is how the adults kept telling me my generation will win, or that they can't wait to see what my generation accomplishes. And while I know that it is always important and inspiring to look at what comes next and the next generation, it is also disappointing to those of us looking towards our future that we will still have to carry these burdens, the burdens that so many adults feel is okay for an 11-year-old girl or a 14-year-old girl to bear the burdens of the continuous cycles of the past. However, I recently wrote for Time magazine on why in the midst of the pandemic, the insanity of this election, and the continuous demoralization and diminishment of Black bodies, I could be optimistic. I have faith in my generation, and I know by the time I am an adult, my generation will have registered more voters and will be voting more than ever. My peers will recognize that every Black life matters, not just the cis, straight, male Black life. My friends are already working to improve climate, water access. My peers and I already believe that healthcare is a human right and that equity is for all, including all genders, races, differently abled, and for the mentally ill. But there is a decent amount of time between now and when I am adult. There is still more work to do. We need to elect more accountable leaders to change the views of our own communities and the views of white women, the uneducated, and many more. We have so much to do to change the whitewashing of history in schools and the media, urgent work to diffuse the hate of the alt-right and the growing hate in our society. The need for educational equity, access to opportunity, and the parity of power to change our legislative landscape to counterbalance the disturbing trends of the court. Many people often come up to me after I've spoken or attend events and say that they cannot wait to see my generation take over for them. But it's my true belief that as long as we are all on this earth, it is everyone's responsibility to make the world a better place, no matter how old you are, until the day that you die. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wadler. That was quite a statement and very moving and powerful. Now we want to call on Spencer Overton, the president of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, which was founded in 1970 and is known as America's Black think tank. Today, the Joint Center's research shapes national discussions on the future of work in Black communities and congressional staff diversity. Spencer is also a tenured professor at George Washington Law, and he is the author of a book and several academic articles, think tank reports, and popular commentaries on race and public policy. Spencer held several policy leadership roles on the 2007-2008 Obama presidential campaign, on the Obama transition team, and as a presidential appointee in the Obama administration. Spencer has also practiced law at the firm Debevoise and Plimpton, clerk for U.S. Attorney Court of Appeals Judge Damon Keith, and graduated with honors from both Hampton University and Harvard Law School. Welcome, Spencer Overton.
Thank you so much. And I want to just start by thanking Naomi for your leadership. You know, we certainly need your voice, your talents, your perspectives, your energy. This struggle that we're a part of, it has gone on for 400 years. We recognize that we are but a link in the chain, and you and your generation are critical to our long-term success. So thank you very much for stepping up in your leadership. It's an honor to be on the panel with you. I also want to thank President Cole and Executive Director Janice Mathis for your leadership and your partnership. Thanks to Rosalind Hannibal Booker, who just joined the staff at NCNW. Thank her for her service to the Joint Center. And I also want to thank our CBC Chair, Karen Bass, and her particularly strong leadership over the last couple of years. This last week, I'm sure she'll talk about it, introducing the Jobs and Justice Act of 2020, and also in particular, her emphasis on connecting the CBC to Black community groups and national civil rights organizations, and really firming up those deep relationships. Incredible and very much appreciated leadership. You know, we are, as the Joint Center, NCNW is a great and close partner. Our literal home is the Dorothy Height building, and all of you all. I look forward to you all stopping by and dropping by when you all are in the building after the pandemic. I want to just talk about a couple of things and leave some of the economic discussion to our back and forth in discussion. Number one, what the CBC chair said in terms of the voting and the census, they are critical. You got to have a plan in terms of voting by mail, early vote, et cetera, having that plan. But then I'll just say this, in all humility, Black women, we need you. We need you in terms of your leadership to mobilize us, to get us out to vote, to get us to the polls. We need you to mobilize other folks to have a plan and get out to vote. And then obviously also in terms of the census. Another thing we need to do is we've got to be prepared for a new political environment. If there is a change in a policy environment, there will be 4,000 positions. And we need, as Black folks, to get our people in key positions that are critical to our community, including a Black woman on the U.S. Supreme Court. Right now, the Joint Center is partnering with NCNW, with the National Action Network, with the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, the NAACP, and 25 other organizations to place Black appointees into a new administration. Again, happy to talk about that later. Also, kind of before I stop, I just want to talk about the importance of supporting Black institutions in this moment, leveraging our relationships with foundations, companies, individuals to provide financial and technical support to Black institutions. So I'm talking about certainly long-standing Black institutions like HBCUs, including my alma mater, Hampton, right? But also NCNW, National Action Network, CBCF, Joint Center, and many others, as well as newer organizations like the Black Futures Lab and Color of Change, and a new generation of organizations. We all have a critical role to play. No one organization is going to do all of this. These organizations are critical for our ability to transcend generations and really give a platform to people like Naomi moving into the future. So NCNW, we've got a lot of work to do, and the Joint Center looks forward to doing with you. And I look forward to discussing policy, Janice, as we move into the discussion session.
Thank you very much, Spencer. And thank you for mentioning that NCNW is a partner with you in the transition project. We think that is critically important because we are expecting and working toward change in November. Chairwoman Bass, let me come back to you now. We've got a few questions we'll pose to you, and then we'll get some from the audience, and you'll charge us, and we'll be moving right along. How can members of NCNW support your efforts to fight voter suppression? And what is the CBC plan to deal with the pandemic?
Well, in terms of voter suppression, this is the first time we can't look at the election actually as being, even though I said this earlier, as being November 3rd. The election is actually starting now, depending on what state you live in. And this is the first time that I can recall where you actually have to have a plan on how to vote, where to vote, when to vote, all of that. We would have never imagined in a million years that an administration would manipulate the post office. And so because of that, we all need to know in our state what to do. And so since we're in this Zoom environment, all of us have had to make this huge life adjustment. There's some real positives to it. Every single individual can do a Zoom call with your entire family and all of your friends from all over the country to say, let's get together and talk about what our plan is to vote. There is a website, iwillvote.com. If you go on that website, you can put in the information for your individual state, city, census tract, et cetera, and it will tell you exactly how to vote in your state. We need to tell everybody that when early voting begins, if you happen to be in an early vote state, that you need to vote right away. Because if there is going to be manipulation in the post office, the only way to combat that is to make sure that our ballots are turned in early. So we can't wait until the end of October to turn in our ballots. Even if you come from a state like I do, California, where the ballots are counted after the date, so long as it's postmarked, we know now that the president and the Republicans are going to challenge that, even where it is legal. So we must vote early. In terms of our plans, the Congressional Black Caucus plans around COVID, let me thank Spencer Overton for talking about mentioning jobs and justice. We introduced that legislation this week. It's 270 bills, 4,000 pages, covering two major sections, a major section on jobs and a major section on justice. Under the justice category, there is health justice. And so we know that COVID has disproportionately impacted our communities. So the Congressional Black Caucus has been working lockstep with the Hispanic Caucus, the Asian Pacific Islander Caucus, and the Native American Caucus, because all of our communities are disproportionately impacted. We have specific legislative solutions that call for concentrated intervention in geographic areas where there is a disproportionate impact. That's not rocket science. That's really kind of obvious. But since there is no national strategy, we have to put that forward. And what that focused intervention means is we need concentrated testing, concentrated tracing, and an emphasis on early aggressive treatment. Testing, tracing, and treatment. And we have found that in many cases, when our folks get sick, they're just denied, they're just sent home. That's one of the reasons why our death rate is so high. If you have early aggressive intervention, the outcome, the prognosis of people is much, much better. And then we have to do everything we can to protect the Affordable Care Act, because just think about it. 9 million people in the United States have gotten COVID. Many more, of course, have tested positive. So you now have a pre-existing condition. Just think about that. And so if the Affordable Care Act is eliminated, then whether you have insurance or not, the companies can say you have a pre-existing condition. We're either going to cancel you or we're going to charge you so much you'll never be able to afford. So there's so many fights ahead of us that are really life and death fights. That's why I keep saying, I mean, this election is about life and death. We can't continue to lose our people in the way that we are. The Congressional Black Caucus has been working very aggressively on COVID. We've even gone now outside of the government since we're dealing with this administration, and we have sought outside funding from foundations to do this intervention in places, not every place where there's a disproportionate impact, but we're trying to do pilot projects so that we can show that if you intervene in these communities, that we'll be able to get a better handle on it. So when we do get our government back, then the government can weigh in with significant funding.
You say, and you say it with such matter of factness, when we get our government back. Just one follow-up. It does seem like the very notion of truth is under attack at this time. And so it may not be fair, but we're very appreciative that the Congressional Black Caucus is taking the role of leading us through this sort of a wilderness that we're going through right now. Ms. Wadler, I'm like the people who tell you that they can't wait for your generation to take over. It makes me feel like retirement might not be such a bad thing if people like you are going to be taking over. But let me ask you this. You're about the same age that Al Sharpton was when he started preaching. What led you to activism at such an early age, and do you expect to spend your career there? And who's influenced you? And what would you say to parents of kids who may be leaning in that direction? How would you advise them?
I've been blessed enough to grow up in a household where I always had conversations with my mom or my dad, or my sister about the political standing of the country, and also what happened to Black women and Black people in America. And really all around, I haven't been sheltered by my parents when it comes to what's going on in the world. So I'm very grateful to have grown up in a place where I could learn about the real world without having to only be able to focus on what's going on in my life. And I think that that definitely played a role in me wanting to get involved in politics, and not just politics, but activism in general. I feel that being an activist has swayed what I want to be when I'm older, now that I have such a greater perspective of what's going on in the world. And as I have since I was younger, I feel like it's my duty to grow up and help other Black women find their voices, and help other Black boys find their voices, and prosper into what they can be, and find out what they can do to make the world a better place. When I grow up, I want to be a journalist, which is definitely something that I've figured out or taken an interest in since I've been speaking out, giving speeches, appearing on panels, because I feel that a lot of the ways that I get my news, not just from my family, but from the journalists that we see on TV, or the news articles that I read, the newspapers that I pick up, I feel like it's such a tremendous responsibility to be conveying um, a sense of news and what's going on in the world to people who trust what you say and who will take what your opinion into account. That's really something that I dream of doing. So I do hope to continue my activism when I grow up, and I hope that all parents learn that their children are going to be grown up at some point and are going to have to go off to college without them, and they might figure out what's happening in the world a hard way. But I think that I'm an example of what happens when parents or guardians take the responsibility upon themselves to educate their children, so that they're not surprised when they realize that the world is not perfect in the ways that they were aware when they were younger.
Well, you certainly have a mature and well-developed sense of what social activism is all about, and I have not one doubt in the world that you will actively pursue that career in journalism and probably end up a Pulitzer Prize winner, affecting many people's opinions. Spencer, let's talk for just a second about what we can expect over the next several weeks. We've heard things like well, we may never know what the election results were. We've heard things like, we don't know whether there'll be a peaceful transition to power or not. What can we say to folk to reassure them that the electoral system is as reliable as can reasonably be expected, and that they should not be deterred? They should be optimistic about the power of their vote. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah. Well, number one, Janice, just to, be adults here with all of us here. You know, throughout our history, the outcome was never assured. But the people who came before us, they focused on what they could control and they did what they could do, right? Whether that was Dorothy Height or Harriet Tubman or Mary Ann Shadd. We focused on what we could control. And so that is really what we need to do, as opposed to getting distracted by all the drama. We need to focus on what we can control, and that's related to getting out the vote, having a plan to vote. Now, the big picture of what we're trying to do is, if we can reduce the folks who are at the polls on polling day, on election day, by folks getting in mail-in ballots and doing early vote and submitting that early or submitting that at a drop box, right? So that we reduce the number of people who have to cast a ballot on election day, and we have clean, secure voting on election day in our communities, as opposed to long lines that can both increase the risk of the transmission of the disease, as well as can slow down our ability to vote. That's what we want to do in terms of executing this plan that Chairwoman Bass talked about. So again, I think we can't be distracted by the drama, and there'll be a lot of stuff. I mean, there'll be misinformation and disinformation on social media. The president and his attack on tech companies is basically trying to prevent them from taking down disinformation right now and making us more vulnerable to Russian interference that ended up suppressing Black votes last time. I know we've got challenges before us. I think we've really just got to keep our eyes on the prize and not get distracted by that, but focus on this getting out the vote, and then also participating in the census.
You mentioned that there's some policy issues that we need to pay attention to, and I want to get to those before we go to the audience questions. So just sort of walk us through, if you will, a couple or three of those policy issues that matter right now. And I know that you're deeply involved in research, and more we're being called upon to make decisions based on data and information. And so if you could weave a little bit of that into your response, it would be helpful.
Certainly. So appreciate that. We've got to convert protest into policy. So part of that is being able to move the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, dealing with pandemic relief targeted at Black communities, like Chairwoman Bass said. Also protecting and strengthening the ACA, which includes expanding Medicare to states where a lot of Black folks are, like North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. Also enacting the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is important. And then also a possible Supreme Court reform that works for Black communities, if that becomes a discussion that we need to have. I do want to hone in on this economic opportunity piece that was just profiled in the slides that you mentioned. Dr. King, this was important to him. Systemic racism is not limited to policing. Our entire economy is founded on anti-Black racism. Shortly after the ratification of the US Constitution, the US quickly became a global economic superpower and undercut China and India as a leader in cotton production because of our no-cost labor in terms of Black folks. And this just was not the South. It wasn't just the South, Janice. Cotton constituted over half of American exports for the first 6 decades of the 1800s. The origins of American capitalism, textiles in New England, banks and shipping in New York and New England, right? This all comes from our work here. After the Civil War, these folks continue to try to profit by keeping us as a form of cheap labor through tactics like Jim Crow and other systemic tactics like opposing unions. So we can't just tweak things. We have to fundamentally reimagine our economy rather than divestment in Black communities. We've got to invest in the humanity of Black folks. So part of that is skills and credentials for good jobs of the future. And when I say good jobs, I'm talking about real living wage jobs with good living wages and benefits. But I'm not just talking about skills and credentials, because that's not going to be everything for us here. Right now, the average white family headed by someone without a high school diploma has more wealth on average than the average Black family headed by someone with a college degree, right? So it's not just credentials and not just skills. They're important, but there are other systemic issues like implicit bias, access to capital for Black businesses, other factors. Technology policy is also a key part. Universal broadband we need for training, work, and school. Right now, you know that 30% of Black households don't have home broadband, 30% of Black households with children, right? So think about what that means right now when virtual learning is going on. Bias in artificial intelligence that affects lending decisions, employment decisions, policing, sentencing, and other functions. Surveillance issues like facial recognition, social media content moderation in terms of voter suppression and online discrimination and hate. Those are big issues, right? Again, from an economic standpoint, a very good start is the CBC Jobs and Justice Act of 2020 that Chairwoman Bass mentioned before. There's more that we need to do as well. So look forward to more discussion on those things.
Let me just ask you one follow-up. I was a little bit, I can remember Nixon talking about a negative income tax back in the 70s, but I was a little bit surprised to hear Dr. King espouse a guaranteed annual income for everybody. And you know, there was one candidate among the Democrats this time who talked about a guaranteed income. Is the world of work changing to the point where we've got to start thinking about a basic standard of living for every human being?
Right. So there's certainly universal basic income is this kind of concept that is out there. And I think, frankly, it really cuts a couple different ways. On one hand, everyone needs the basics of life just to participate. That's definitely needed. There are people that I trust, though, like Black economist Sandy Darity, who has said that a federal guaranteed job is actually better than universal basic income. He would say a universal basic income subsidizes a Walmart or some other big companies so they can keep their wages low because everybody has $10,000. Whereas if you had a federal job guarantee, those companies would be competing against the federal government to get good talent and would have to increase their wages here. So there are different takes on this, but I think the main point is we need to recognize, we need to ensure that folks have resources to live here. Part of that is safety net, but part of it is also ensuring that people have good jobs with benefits and livable wages.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you so much. Chairwoman Bass, so much good legislation passed during the 116th Congress. The Justice and Policing Act, Spencer's already named the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. The HEROES Act, do we expect it to be reintroduced maybe under different names or different forms in the next Congress?
Well, let me just say a couple of things. One, I could listen to Professor Overton all day. I loved his historical reference. And I want to address that first because, you know, when I saw all of the protests after George Floyd's torture and murder, it was the first time that I recall hearing people link up a murder with systemic racism, having that become a term now that people use regularly. Now, I'm sure that people don't necessarily all understand, but the fact that it is actually being talked about now. And I think that the wreckage that has happened in our country over the last 3.5 years of this administration, and I do mean wreckage because every person that was appointed as a member of the cabinet's job was to essentially destroy the agency that they were in charge of. And so when we have a new administration, we have to think about rebuilding, but rebuilding in a better way. I mean, actually, our candidate says build back better. I'm not going to go there, but just take education, for example, as Spencer was talking about. We know that our kids have been left out and might be out of school for almost 2 years by the time we are back to a normal life. So we can't just go back. We have to do much, much better. It would be an opportunity to address the achievement gap that I believe because of COVID is going to be 10 miles wide as opposed to what it was before. So we have to use the pandemic and its health consequences, its economic consequences to say that we need to address the underlying health conditions that have made our community more at risk. We can't address them right now because we're in the middle of a crisis, but we need to look at fundamental change in our institutions to examine what happens in our institutions that really facilitate the institutional racism. It is an opportunity to rebuild, but rebuild in a much more fundamental, comprehensive way. We can't just go back to business as usual. So you mentioned the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. You mentioned the Voting Rights Act. Because of what we're dealing with now with the Supreme Court, I think it is going to have to wait until the next session. I think they will probably go ahead and confirm this justice before the election. And I think it's going to create such chaos that our normal lame duck session after an election is going to be very, very chaotic. Of course, I am hoping that that lame duck session will mean that we will have a new Senate and that we will be in charge of the Senate, because if we just elect a new president, we know from our experience with Barack Obama, he will not be able to govern unless we have the Senate as well. And we obviously will be celebrating an incredible achievement to have our senator, well, my senator, Senator Kamala Harris from California, be the vice president of the United States, for the first woman to, not just the fact that we have a woman, but that we have a Black woman who will be the vice president. You can only imagine the grief that the two of them will get if we do not have the Senate as well. And so George Floyd, voting rights, I think we'll have to wait for a new administration. You also mentioned the HEROES Act. The HEROES Act is about COVID relief. And I am hoping that we will be able to deal with that. What you're going to see in the House this week coming up, we will probably take a vote on a new COVID package. But the question that will be answered this week is whether it will be a vote that's a Democratic vote or whether they will actually come to a deal and it will be bipartisan. Interestingly, the debate over whether or not to provide any additional COVID relief, for whatever reason, the Senate does not want to provide resources to states and cities. Now, states and cities, you're talking about first responders, you're talking about teachers, you're talking about healthcare. I don't quite understand how the Republican senators can get away with harming their own states, but they seem to. But maybe in this election, enough of them will have to pay the consequences and will actually be able to have the Senate as well as the White House.
And of course, those consequences are hearing the wrath of the voters at the polls. There are lots of lists. Would you care to say which states our members come from? Everywhere. They're from 32 states. If you're in, say, Kentucky, should you be paying a special attention to the Senate race? Where should we be? Where are the opportunities in the Senate?
Sure. The most likely opportunities are Arizona, Colorado, and Maine. Those are the three that are most at risk. But we got to do everything we can to return Doug Jones. And so Doug is in trouble in Alabama. But we have other states where we have absolute potential. You know, I mean, South Carolina, Jamie Harrison has just done amazing. Really I love seeing Lindsey Graham crying on TV talking about he's getting hit, but with so much money coming into his opponent. Well, that's a good thing. So, we need to think about North Carolina. I mean, Georgia, there's a number of states, but just in terms of priorities where the senators are most at risk. I mean, even Joni Ernst in Iowa, there's a possibility there. So we are running well in states that we would not have expected to be running well at all. But what we have to be careful of is that we didn't understand Russia 4 years ago. We didn't understand what was happening. But when it comes to our young people, we know that there will be specific messaging, especially to Black men, specific messaging to discourage them, to say, well, Biden did the crime bill, Harris was an AG, Trump has his platinum plan, and he's going to give all this money to us. So the deliberate attempts to confuse our people, that's the role we can also play too, letting young people know if you're getting all these messages talking about, Trump, there's no difference between Biden and Trump, that's so you don't vote. And if you remember, after the last election, Trump celebrated the fact that the African-American vote was down. But we do remember now, what did the sisters do? 88% of Black women did what we were supposed to do. And 80% of Black men did. So we just have to make sure that we get our vote out. Since they are going to so much trouble to stop our vote, that sure says something.
It certainly does. Ms. Wadler, I want to turn to you with a different question. I've seen proposals in Europe and a few states here in the United States that would lower the voting age from 18 down to maybe 16. It'll be another 5 years before you can register to vote. Do you think lowering the voting, 16-year-olds in some places can drive, they can get married, they can drop out of school, they can get a job. Do you think 16-year-olds generally are capable of handling the franchise?
I think that we can't talk about lowering the voting age without talking about educational equity in the United States. Being able to vote responsibly and utilize your right to vote in the first place. I think that a lot of kids my age and a lot of teenagers in general, even a lot of adults, feel that their vote won't count. And as Ms. Bass said, there's no difference between Trump and Biden. So there's really no use in voting in any election. I think that that's way too common of a mindset. So if schools and rec centers and places that really are able to connect with kids were able to teach them throughout their childhoods how important voting and having and utilizing the right to vote is, and teaching them about candidates and more about the judicial and the government in general, I think it would be a lot easier to have the conversation about whether or not 16-year-olds would be able to utilize their right to vote responsibly and in a good way. In general, I think that if schools and other places were able to teach kids more about what it meant to vote and how to choose who to vote for, I think it would be a more reasonable conversation to have. Lowering the voting age to 16. I think that now when schools try to generally keep out of politics, if we were able to discuss politics in a very bipartisan way, because respectfully, I think it would be a better conversation to have whether or not we should lower the voting age.
Well, thank you.
Let me just build on one of Naomi's points, just to build on this educational equity piece, because I think it's great if we can get young folks registered in school, and that can be a part of it, and there can be real discussions. But right now, schools are locally funded. You know that many people are trying to privatize education and further defund public education. And so we wouldn't want a scenario where, okay, we move in this direction, but there's not educational equity, and school districts that are overwhelmingly Black are not engaged in terms of kids and helping them get involved and having the resources to help them get involved. So I just think she makes a very good point that educational equity really has to be coupled with this notion of the franchise. And I'm all for it conceptually. I just think we need to make sure that young people in Black communities are able to participate as well.
As long as we fund public education with ad valorem taxes, we've got a conundrum. I understand, Chairman Bass, that you have to leave us soon. I could engage in conversation with you all day, but please give us your comments before you go.
Sure. Well, first of all, again, it is such an honor to be with you today. And I just love the work that you do. It's just so important. We have 30 plus days. We just have to do every single thing we can because we cannot go 4 more years. We just simply cannot. And I am confident. I mean, one of the ironies of the last 3.5 years, I always say to people is that, you know how he said he was going to bring us all together? Well, I think he has brought us all together. He brought us all together in opposition to him. And just think about it for a minute, because ever since the Women's March, where we had protesters on every continent on planet Earth, where I didn't even know there were enough people to protest. In Antarctica, people protested. But we might not be in the streets every day on every issue. But if you think about it, since he has been in office, we have been running for everything and we have been winning, not just Congress, local seats, state seats. We won close to 400 seats in 2018. It took the Republicans years to do that. The question for us is to keep the momentum going. We now understand each other's issues. We work across category because the last 3.5 years has been an assault on all of us, whether you were talking about the Muslim ban, immigrants, now Asians. We've all been under attack and it has brought us together. We need to maintain our unity, maintain our momentum, and get this across the finish line. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Chairwoman Bass, we thank you for your service to the country. Black women are not just leading Black communities, they're leading the nation now, and we're sorely in need of your leadership and grateful for it. So thank you for joining the National Council of Negro Women today.
Thank you all.
Now I think what we'd like to do, if Mr. Overton and Ms. Wadler, if you're amenable, we'll take a few questions from the audience. If the tech crew will help us, there is a dialogue box at the bottom of your screen that says chat. You can go there and enter your question. It's being monitored, and we will see if we can't get our panel to respond. I'm sure they will respond to any questions that you might have. We can start with the members of our executive committee, some of whom are right here in the speaker's waiting room. If any of you have questions, you can unmute yourself and pose those questions now. And of course, Mr. Overton, if you want to comment further on any aspect of the conversation so far, please feel free to do so as well.
Hi, Executive Director Janice Mathis. This is Brenda Anderson. I have a question. And the question is for Mr. Overton. Do you see what is happening with the actions of number 45 and the Republicans as their last ditch effort of trying to maintain control because the society is changing and they realize they are actually losing and it is a new day and age?
Thank you so much. So I think some of that is going on. But what I would pose to you is that that's something that was going on in the aftermath of Reconstruction. It's something that was going on, you know, in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, that this has been going on for a long time. And it's not going to be a scenario where we simply elect a Black president or elect a Black female vice president who becomes president that is going to change everything. One of the reasons I'm so big into institutions, one of the reasons that NCNW is so important is that individuals come and go, policies come and go, institutions are with us and remain there, right? Like, so if everything was great for Jewish folks, just completely great, they would not say, let's get rid of the Anti-Defamation League. They would say, we need a strong Anti-Defamation League because we don't know what the future will bring and when things will spike up, etc. So yes is the answer. But what I'm saying is that this is not a battle. This is one of the reasons Naomi is so important. this battle is not going to be won during our lifetimes, right? This is going to go on, and we need institutions. It's kind of like, we have to build a strong ark because the flood is out there. And for us to survive, as opposed to us simply saying, well, we're going to go to this day and everything's going to be perfect and everything's always getting better. And when it's better, we can all relax. We've got to build institutions that protect Black folks no matter what happens 50 years from now, 100 years from now, et cetera. There will be ups and downs. We need to be able to adjust and respond to those ups and downs.
I can remember about 40, maybe 50 years ago when I thought the problems of poverty and voting rights would be resolved in my lifetime. And now I realize that I'm working for my grandson's generation. And that is that we are, you said something about being a link in a continuing chain of effort. And it gets better, it gets gradually better and more progressive and more inclusive. But it is a long, perpetual endeavor. Are there other questions? There are a couple of additional questions from the webinar. If you could read them for us, Ms. Cook Holmes, or however you can. Yes, please.
We're reading them right now. Turn them down so I don't get feedback.
While we're waiting, you're
And I will summarize it as asking how someone who is actually in a red district can get support for their run for office. So if there are any suggestions of how, if someone is running for office, that they can get support from their communities, they're in a red district, but really trying to get support from their Black and brown sisters. So any kind of suggestions would be appreciated.
I can offer one example. We talked a little bit about South Carolina. Jamie Harrison, if you had asked anybody a year ago whether Lindsey Graham could be knocked off by an upstart first timer, Jamie Harrison, you probably would have been laughed out of the conversation. But now we're looking at him, and for weeks, the polls have been virtually tied in ruby red, South Carolina, which is my home state. And so I think there's always the opportunity. It requires building slowly, finding allies where you can, converting those who might be independents or leaning on the fence where you cannot, and building that constituency. And there's certain basic things everybody wants: a measure of economic security, education for their children, medical care when they're sick, focusing on those basic issues. But Spencer, you're the expert, please.
Now, I would, just basically say what you say, elaborated on it a bit in terms of one, a lot of offices, including many of the most important offices, do not have a partisan designation. Many local elections do not have a partisan designation. So I think that's something that's important to lift up, and how low turnout is in those local elections, and how that civic engagement is incredibly important. Second piece, obviously, Doug Jones is a model that people talk about, and the question is, what's the future of that? I think the third issue I'd bring up is, and there are a lot of issues that aren't really addressed by either party well, in terms of future of work. I think that sometimes progressives are okay with poverty alleviation, but in terms of building Black wealth, that's not always at the top of the agenda. So I think that there's some issues that can kind of transcend areas in terms of, Black businesses and some other things. And then, finally, I would focus on the fact that, I was in the Obama administration. I certainly believe in, progressive values, but I definitely think we need Black folks in both parties who are committed to Black people. So I'm not talking about Black folks who are looking for a shorter line. I'm not talking about Black folks who are opportunistic in any case. I'm talking about Black folks who are committed to Black communities in both parties. If you look at an organization like AIPAC that focuses on promoting Israel's interests here. You know, they are very active in terms of both parties here. And as Black folks, you know, we certainly want to have friends in all places that are focused on our issues rather than just using us as a pawn or trying to suppress our vote because they view us as, you know, yeah. So we just want folks focused on serving us and our issues.
Is there another question, Ms. Cook Holmes?
Yes, as we are building those coalitions, have we done anything to reach out to those in white communities that voted for Trump last time to see if we can help them to change their votes this election?
We'll go back to Spencer, but is Ms. Wadler still with us? Would you care to comment on that question, Ms. Naomi?
I think that it does happen, but it's also pretty significantly rare for someone who is set in their mindset and who's been raised a certain way to suddenly change their view on systemic racism, racism in general in the US, or police brutality. All of the people that I have met, I make it a point to have an open and non-judgmental conversation with them, even if I'm on the receiving end of the hate in the conversation. I do feel that we should all respect each other's points of view. I do find it hard myself to respect someone else's point of view when it comes to my rights and the rights of my people. A lot of people will come up to me and say that political views shouldn't be something to stop a friendship and that we should be able to disagree on politics. But I do feel that it is intertwined, but the rights of Black people in the US is not a political or radical statement either, saying that we shouldn't be killing Black people on the streets or in their own homes, like what happened to George and Breonna. I don't think that that should be a radical act of anti-racism. That should just be common sense. So I do feel that we should be actively making an effort to communicate with people who might not agree with us when it comes to human rights or the Civil Rights Act, and who don't feel that what we have to say is valuable or correct, politically correct or correct in any way. I do think that we should be actively making an effort to communicate with them and try to get them to change their vote. But that also shouldn't be where we're putting all of our energy, because it's probably rare that we're going to sit down and have one conversation or a couple conversations with a white or other person who believes that systemic racism isn't a thing and that they shouldn't see color. And that Trump is the best option for a president over Biden or anyone else. It's not that likely that they're going to change their perspective in that conversation. So I don't think that we should be spending a lot of time trying to convince those people otherwise. But it would be interesting to continue to have conversations with people on the other side of the spectrum.
Were you encouraged by the number of non-Black people who demonstrated in the George Floyd demonstrations? And even with the Parkland, there seemed to be some reaching out across barriers of color to think about these issues in a more practical, objective way.
I think that many Black women have grown up, and Black people in general, being told that it's not their place or their responsibility to educate their white peers in the classroom or outside of it. But I was impressed with the amount of non-Black people I saw protesting and exercising their freedom of speech, advocating for what they believe is right. And I'm very grateful that people are at least making an effort to understand what the Black community is going through today and what we have been going through for the entire history of this country. I appreciate it, but I also have to stop myself sometimes from further trying to explain what our experiences are to people who may not understand, because that's not my place, and it shouldn't be my job or our job to educate those who don't necessarily understand. But I was impressed with the amount of non-Black people I saw outside protesting, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. Are there other questions?
Can I just respond to that last one here quickly? So one, some folks would say that Black folks in South Carolina did just that in terms of who they selected for the presidential candidate, right? That was an affirmative outreach to someone who could connect with, middle American voters, right? Second piece, like Naomi, I think a priority, we have to prioritize. We got to focus on Black institutions, getting Black voters out, getting folks to invest in supporting Black mobilization as opposed to simply, convincing undecided or other folks. So centering on us. And then the third piece here is, I think as Black folks, we got to recognize the difference between those people who use dog whistles and play on cultural things to maintain their power, right? And there are some of those leaders. And, those folks who are victims of that and those people who are manipulated by that. And we do, once we kind of get our thing together, have to come up with communications and other efforts so that those folks can't use those dog whistles as effectively, and we are able to effectively communicate to folks who aren't Black, but who feel disempowered in society and are looking for an outlet here. And piling on the Black people is not the solution, and it's not the thing that's going to get them what they want, and helping them with that.
And I would say that some of the most ardent users of those dog whistles represent some of the most impoverished, underrepresented states. That it's to your point that sometimes people are being manipulated or used because they have been left out of the economic mainstream. They are suffering from lack of equity in education and healthcare, and they need the Affordable Care Act. But instead of getting what they need, they're getting what some politician is willing to feed them in terms of where their resentment should lie. I think that's unfortunate, but it's not a coincidence that some of the most ardent rabble rousers about race represent some of the poorest white people in this country. And it's time for that to be exposed, in my view. Are there other questions from the audience?
We have a couple more questions, probably one for each of our panelists. So this one, kind of coming back to the Black community, in the last election, Christian Black men, at least some of them, were saying that they would not vote for a woman in Senator Clinton. What do we say now when they are saying the same thing about Senator Harris?
I am not a theologian, but I would say that the women were first at the tomb to witness Jesus' resurrection, that he trusted them implicitly, that they were his closest aides and advisors, that Magdalene being a prostitute was a vicious rumor and a smear, and that they should look at Jesus for who he was. But I am not a theologian, and so I will ask Spencer or Ms. Wadler to respond to that.
I am not a theologian either. I think what's so hard for me to even conceptualize this is people voting against their own interests based on that just kind of contorted reading of scripture. And so, I just think it's a fundamental flaw in terms of the reading of scripture. And, I'm sorry that I don't have any great strategies, communication strategies to address it. It's just so far afield of where we need to be as Black folks. And, I think, I don't know that we're going to solve that in the next 8 weeks. And I think that the way we do solve it is by really mobilizing and getting folks out who, recognize the importance of this moment.
I know that the incumbent presidential campaign has put a lot of energy into attracting Black men and supporting candidates like Kanye West. Does the data show that those strategies are working as far as you can tell?
I think they only have to peel off a small percentage. So I think that there are a lot of strategies. Obviously, you've got the Kanye West strategy. I think that there is the, kind of trying to play to the hypermasculinity issue and piece. I think that the social media disinformation strategy is another strategy, right? So a lot of this is about how do we confuse, manipulate, disorient the Black vote with a special effort with regard to some Black males. And, that's something we got to just fight against and be focused on and be aware of the fact that it's going on.
Ms. Wadler, would you care to comment, dear?
I don't have any comment. I completely agree, but I do think that the use of religion to discriminate, especially coming from the Black community, is outrageous. I think that as we are the people who were just advocating for our voices to be heard, because we can't control being Black and we shouldn't be seen as less than for the color of our skin. We should be feeling the exact same way towards the LGBTQ plus community, the women of our society, and all people who are a part of the minority. And we shouldn't be discriminating as white people have done to us in the past.
Thank you very much for your very mature comment. You're remarkable. Of course, you know that already. Are there any other questions? We'll take maybe one or two more.
There's another one, and I just want to say that I'm getting so many accolades for the panelists, for all of you, as well as the moderator, but a whole bunch from Ms. Wadler.
Absolutely.
Say that. And this question is actually for you, Ms. Wadler. How do you get young protesters to vote? And they're asking, what are your peers discussing in school, and any views that you can share for going forward?
I'm lucky to be attending a school where anti-racism work is incorporated into a lot of classrooms. For example, in French class, I'm learning about how most of the countries who use French as their main language are actually in Africa as opposed to Europe. And I'm very lucky to be able to learn that kind of stuff in school, but I know that that's definitely not a common experience throughout the public or private education system in the United States. And I hope that schools as mine, my past two schools have been doing, will encourage young kids to educate themselves when it comes to journalism and look deeper into what voting means, and encourage them in ways that lets them know that their vote counts. I think that the majority of people who stay home on election day really feel that it's not going to make a difference, when in reality, every vote counts. So I hope that, like is happening in my own school, many other schools will continue to discuss how important it is for voting in the election and utilizing their voice in general.
Thank you very much. I think at this point, what we want to do is get your closing comments, and then we'll call on Dr. Cole to end our session today. Would you like to go first, Spencer? It doesn't matter.
I defer to you all. You all make the decision.
Ms. Wadler, would you make your closing comments, please?
Sure. I just want to thank everyone for having me here. I'm very grateful to be able to utilize my platform in this way, and I hope that everyone, I was about to say in this room, but of course we are virtual, takes someone with them to vote and takes into account how important their vote and their voice really is to the future of this country. I'm not old enough to vote, but I hope that the people in this room who can take what everyone's been saying into account when they cast their ballot. And I hope that everyone leaves today being aware of the tremendous impact that they can have on the country as a whole.
Before we come to you, Spencer, we do have a video greeting from Reverend Al Sharpton, and we want to play that, and then we'll come to you for your closing comments, and then to Dr. Cole, our esteemed president.
Hi, I'm Reverend Al Sharpton, founding president of National Action Network. Let me give my greetings first to all of you at NCNW. I was privileged in my youth to work in the later years of her life with the Honorable Dorothy Height and speak at her wake when she made her transition. And I've been honored for much of my activist life since I was a kid to work with Attorney Janice Mathis. Both of us was in many ways mentored by Reverend Jesse Jackson. And we've, down through the years, walked shoulder to shoulder. As you ponder this question, where do we go from here? Where we must go is follow the roadmap laid out for us by Dr. Height, by our elders and our forefathers. And that is to turn this hour into an hour of our standing on the landmarks laid for us and refusing to go backwards. We're at a time where they're trying to hijack a Supreme Court seat, going against the procedures they laid out when President Obama had nominated Justice Garland. And they said we should not have a selection process of a Supreme Court justice in an election year. That seat was made available because of the death of Justice Scalia, who died on Valentine's Day that year, February 14th, way before the election. This seat is available because of the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who just died in September, while people are already voting in this election in Virginia and in Minnesota. We're also witnessing the whole question of the Affordable Care Act being reversed. We're seeing voting being denied and suppressed. We're seeing police and racial incidents all over this country. That's part of where we are, and much, much more. But where do we go in tough times? The tough get going, and the tough unite and come together above our egos and our personal agendas. And those that have expertise in certain areas, they do that and blend it with the rest. If all of us do what it is that we do well, it'll work. We must use this hour, though, to pass legislation. That's what Dr. Height, Dr. King, and them did. They used the marches in the South and in Mississippi and the 63 March on Washington and the Birmingham movement to go from 63 to the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act. We must use all of this protest, including the big march we had in Washington just 4 weeks ago, to push the George Floyd Policing and Justice Act, which would put federal law to how policing is done, and to the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which would, before the Supreme Court can do anything, put a new bill there that would take them time to even try to challenge and come up. We must unite. We must deal with the economic inequality by having collective campaigns against those in the private sector that has closed the door to equity and parity. We know what to do because we've done it. Just do it again. Oh, Ramal, we can't win. They're suppressing our votes. What do you mean we can't win? We just a few years ago elected and re-elected a black man whose name we didn't even know well for a couple of months, Barack Obama, elected and re-elected him president of the United States. Why? Because we got together in numbers they couldn't cheat. How did we win other boycotts in the economic arena? Because we withdrew in numbers they couldn't resist. How did we deal with making laws before? We kept in the streets and affected the suites until those in the Senate and the Congress had to pass the laws. We already passed the George Floyd law in the House of Representatives and the John Lewis law. It's the Senate we must make move now. And 43 senators are in races now. If we are strategic and together, we can tell them, you vote for us or we're not going to vote for you. Where do we go from here is we need to remind ourselves who we are and why we are. We're the children of people that turned this country around and changed how it conducted themselves. We're not social climbers. We are social changers. And that's what we need to remember. That's what's in our blood. That's our lineage. That's who we are. Yes, we look good, but we fight hard and we don't take no mess. It's messy times. It's time to straighten things up. I'll see you, Janice Mathis, on the battlefield. I've never been on the battlefield and couldn't look across and see you, not behind me, but beside me, and many times in front of me. No justice, no peace.
No justice, no peace. Well, that was That was good to hear from Reverend Al. He can always get us fired up. Spencer, bring us back to earth with the practicalities of supporting these Black institutions and making the plan. I've got a whole list of things that I got from you that I'm going to share, but I want to hear what you have to say about it before we go there.
We know it's tough to follow Reverend Al, and we talked about a lot today in terms of supporting Black institutions and policies, and Reverend Sharpton did. But Janice, let me just say this. The people who are watching this program, they are gonna make the change that Reverend Sharpton mentioned. You know that Black women out of every demographic have the highest turnout in terms of voting. You know, you saw what Black women did. The reason Kamala Harris is on the ticket is Black women said, this is important to us. We are worthy, we are valuable, we are worthwhile, and they articulated. They didn't just sit around and say, well, somebody will take care of us. We do all this work, I'm sure they'll take care of us. They had an important voice here, Black women, in terms of making that happen, in terms of agency. So right now, when our republic is at this turning point, where, and it's not just Black folks, and it's not just the future of this country, really it is the future of the world in terms of the outsized influence that the United States has had in terms of changing lives in the past, right? Across the globe, right? Your work right now in terms of voting is critical here. And we'll talk about transition and we'll talk about personnel, but right now, and we'll talk about the Supreme Court and Supreme Court reform, but right now, this notion of Black women being engaged and being the leaders in our community and the leaders in our country in terms of getting people out to vote, that is critical right now. I can't end on anything else simply because it's so important. I know we heard it, but we just can't say it enough because it's so important. So voter mobilization, getting folks to the polls to vote, various ways to do it, that's what's key right now.
Thank you, Spencer Overton, President of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, and a real scholar intellectual. We appreciate your being here today. Ms. Naomi Wadler, I hope I live another 10 years or so. It's going to be so much fun watching you do what you're bound to do, and congratulate your parents for me. Now, with this program, as well as most of the rest of the convention, has been recorded. Much of it is already available at NCNW's Facebook page. The rest of it will be available within a week or so, posted on our website, www.ncnw.org. Please share these materials, download them, have watch parties, share this material so that you and all of us can be mobilized to do what we need to do. Dr. Cole, I thank you for the privilege of having this opportunity today to speak to our people. Please come and share your closing comments with us.
Sister ED, first and most importantly, I've got to turn to an African tradition called giving a praise song. It's a praise song that begins with you, because this panel, so outrageously informative and inspiring, was what you imagined. And then working with Dr. Thelma T, you made a plan, and then you executed the plan. And we have all been such beneficiaries of it. What an extraordinary way, not to bring closure. There is no closure, but to take a deep breath, plan some more. What a way to do that. I appreciate that my dearest sister friend, the sister chair, had to move on. But let me tell you something. You gotta feel not just hopeful, but confident that this unbelievably long journey that we are on is gonna have fewer detours because you got that sister chair at the head of the Congressional Black Caucus. There is something I would very much like to say to Naomi. Naomi, perhaps you took a little break. Ah, there you are. Naomi, when I had the privilege of being the president of Spelman College, and then, of course, also at Bennett, but it was at Spelman that I first fully understood that if you see one, you can be one. That's the real importance of our historically Black colleges and universities. But you also, at this age, you have that same ability that I witnessed repeatedly at Spelman and at Bennett. You have the ability simply to be an activist. And because you are, other young people will say, I can see one, I can be one. But the thing that is just almost overwhelming to me is that you have that same power with adults. To see you as an activist is to say to your elders, if I can see one, then I can be one. Now, what do I say to my neighbor? I guess I could start with this pattern. I don't know where it came from, but it's all over the Black church community. Turn and say, hello, neighbor. Hello, neighbor. But Brother Spencer, Brother President, what I so deeply treasure in you is your ability to take the complexities of both our history and our current reality and say, look, here it is. It's really not so complicated. I wish I had some real Black girl magic, because if I did, you know what I'd do? Just like that. I would clone you and just spread you around. Because, Brother President, before activism, there really must be thought. And I'm not embarrassed to say, putting thought in a historical and a historical context helps the struggle. It doesn't take away from the struggle. Well, we all cannot thank you enough, Sister Edie, for pulling on that very close camaraderie that you have with the Brother Rev. I mean, he is simply priceless in his ability not only to lead in the march, but to keep reminding us of why we're marching. So my NCNW sisters, we will, of course, have a gala tonight, but this is the moment when we do take a big pause, because this is the last of the formal plenaries of our 59th convention. I think this is a way that I have the best chance of being meaningful to bring us to this point. I'm wearing my pin. I'm wearing the pin not because it's attractive jewelry. I'm wearing this pin because of what Brother President just said. There is nothing that we in the National Council of Negro Women must do right now that is more important than what we've always done. You're right, Brother President. Like Dr. Dorothy Irene Height said, Black women don't often get to do what they want to do, but they always do what they have to do. If we ever had to vote ourselves and mobilize others to vote, it's now. Sister Chair is right. This is life and death at stake. And yet the forces against our voting are really strong. So I want to bring forward memory of a woman who I and you associate as inseparable from the struggle to vote. A woman who also, unfortunately, we have to remember as a victim of state-sponsored violence. You know I'm talking about Fannie Lou Hamer. My respect for her is so deep, it's hard for me not to say, Miss Fannie Lou Hamer, ma'am. But we remember the number of times that she led Black folk to vote. And we also remember those dogs, and we remember those fire hoses, and we remember those billy clubs to suppress her right to vote through sheer brutality. And we remember that when jailed, on an occasion when she was walking across, leading folk to vote, jailed. And indeed, a white jailer sent a white, not jailer, a white owner of the jail sent a Black imprisoned man to literally beat her, almost taking her life. Fannie Lou Hamer died much too early because of that beating. Suffered in her last years because her body had been so brutally beaten. Well, now I really am going to bring us to that point where we leave the meeting by telling you a story. And I've told it before, and I'm going to tell it again and again. But it's Fannie Lou Hamer's story. Miss Hamer would tell this story at the end of a gathering, of an organizing, of a speech, when she wanted to say, where do we go from here? When she wanted to respond to the question, so what do we do now? So let me tell that story very quickly. The last line of the story will answer the question, what do we do now? Where do we go from here? Miss Hamer said it was one day when a bunch of boys, she told the story about a bunch of boys. I prefer it to be a bunch of boys than a bunch of girls. Sorry, my bias. A bunch of boys decided they'd play hooky from school. But it wasn't going to be any fun just to play hooky from school if they couldn't get into a little bit of trouble. They had a ringleader, and the ringleader said, come on, we can find some trouble. He found a bird and decided just to really torment that bird, almost to the point of taking the bird's life. But then that was no more fun. So then they said, well, what else are we gonna do now that we're playing hooky from school today? Then he said, wait, I've got an idea. We're gonna go up the road a piece to that old lady. That old lady who thinks she knows so much just because she's old. But I'm gonna ask that old lady a question that she will never be able to answer. So what's the question? Asked the boys. The ringleader said, you see this bird that we just finished messing with? I'm gonna put it behind my back. And then I'm gonna say, old lady, this bird I've got behind my back, is it dead or is it alive? And if the old lady says the bird, why the bird is dead, I'm gonna release my hand and the bird will fly away. But if the old lady says the bird is alive, I'm gonna crush it. So you see, she can't answer the question. Oh, the bumps. And it wasn't even in the middle of a coronavirus. But these young boys did the bumps, they did the high five. They were convinced the old lady couldn't answer the question. So off they went to find her. And they did. And using language and a posture that most of our young boys would never use. But this group of boys did. The ringleader said, yo, old lady, you gonna answer this question? But with that sense of unending love, even when a form of, if not hate, disrespect is there, she said, my sons, I'll try. So said the ringleader, you see this bird? All right, old lady, you think you know so much. I'm gonna put my hand behind my back. Now you tell me about the bird. The old lady. The old lady, like old ladies, in Mount Olive AME Church that grew me up in Jacksonville, Florida. Old ladies like the one who sat at the end of Louisiana Street when my sister and I came home from school, and she checked on us and told our parents on us if we were doing what we weren't supposed to do. That old lady said, the bird. Now let me think about the bird. The ringleader said, oh, come on, old lady. I told you, just tell me about the bird behind my back. She said, I'm thinking. The bird. The bird. The bird. Why, young son, the bird, it's in your hands. My NCNW sisters, Brother President, Spencer, activist, Naomi, that's the answer. Yes, metaphorically, but in another way, concretely, it's in our hands. Sisters of NCNW, we've got to act, to vote, and to bring any and everybody we know with us to follow the voting plan. It's in your hands, Sister ED, to formally tell us if we can push, leave the meeting. You gotta unmute to do it, Janice. Thank you, Brother President.
Thank you
Bye-bye,
so
ladies.
much, Dr. Cole. Thank you.